So this is my sourdough starter, and it's been in my fridge for longer than I'd like to admit. This has probably been in the fridge at least all summer, and now it's October. So we have lots of fall and winter baking going on. We have lots of holiday baking going on, company coming over. So this sourdough starter needs to be revived. So I'm gonna take you through my week and see if we can revive this sourdough starter. And I wanna show you that it's a lot easier than you think. So this is a weck jar. I really like keeping these in weck jars. They have these little closures, and it's glass, so it's nice and sturdy. So this is what my sourdough starter is looking like right now. And if you can see at the bottom there, there's a little bit of liquid. This is very common when you leave it in the fridge, and this is what they refer to as hooch. So the first thing that I'm going to do is put this hooch down the drain, and then we will start feeding our sourdough starter and nursing it back to a nice bubbly health. So here's a close-up shot of what we're starting with. You can see there's a little bit of that liquid that's gathered. There's no bubbles at all. It's just pretty much a solid mass at the bottom of this jar. But we're gonna make this vibrant and bubbly and back to making really good, healthy sourdough bread and other baked goods. So I want to show you how easy this is. And I know that the consensus with sourdough is that you need to be meticulous about measuring things, but I want to show you that that's really not necessarily true. I have been using Lisa from Farmhouse on Boone's method ever since I started this sourdough starter. I use her directions, and she has such a natural, very nonchalant way going about having her sourdough. She uses it every day, all the time, and she just mixes it and does it by feel. When she's baking bread, she'll typically measure things out, as I will too, but when it comes to actually feeding your sourdough, you don't have to do measurements. You can just eyeball it and do it by what the mixture looks like. So what I'm gonna do is I have some filtered water here, and I have just organic all-purpose flour. And I'm going to start in just putting as equal parts as I can. It doesn't have to be meticulously measured on a scale. You can just go for what the thickness of this is. So we want to try to get a pancake batter mixture using equal parts water and flour. So I'm going to start with flour. This is about a 1/4 cup I'm starting with. And since I have so little in here already, I'm not going to discard any of this. If it was up to here, I wouldn't discard about half of it, but since we're way down here, we have the whole rest of the jar for this to rise. So I'm just starting with about 1/2 cup of flour, and then I'm going to pour in what I assume is about 1/2 cup of water. And then I'm just going to take a little rubber spatula. I find this to be the easiest thing to use. And we're gonna mix that together. And what we're looking for is pancake batter consistency. It's gonna be a bit lumpy. It's gonna be a little bit on the thicker side. And that's what we wanna see. So if you can see here, this is what I've got going. And honestly, that's pretty ideal. It's not too thick. I might thin it out just a tad, but that's pretty good consistency. I'm gonna do just a tad bit more water and give that a good mix. All right, and this is gonna be a good start. You see how it moves freely? But it's still thick enough. It's not super watery coming off of my spatula here. So that's a good thickness to start with. So then our next step that we're gonna do is put the lid back on, and you don't need to use the closures tightly this time. You can just use a loose lid. I'm just gonna loosely put this on. And normally when you're just feeding your sourdough starter regularly, you don't really need any kind of heat. But since I want to reactivate this and get this really nice and bubbly, I'm gonna use a heat source, at least for the first day or two. So there's 2 ways you can do that. You can put it either next to a heat source, like an oven, say you have your oven on. you're cooking something else, you're gonna wanna put this by your oven. Or say it's cold outside, you have your fireplace going, you can put it on the fireplace mantle, somewhere where it's gonna get heat. Or if you're a gardener and you have, say, like a heat mat for seed starting, say you start your tomatoes indoors or peppers and you use the heat mat, that's a good option too. So since I'm not cooking anything right now, I'm gonna go get my heat mat, plug it in, and I'm going to set this on top of the heat mat so that it can get started. So here is my heat mat. Like I said, I use this for seed starting, so it's pretty large because it usually has seed starting trays going across it. But mine also comes with this little temperature gauge. You don't have to have this, but some of them do come with it. And I'm gonna set it to pretty low temp. Right now it's set to about 70 degrees. That's plenty. So this is going to start heating up. And then all I'm going to do is just place my starter on the mat, let it sit here for the day. Later on, maybe when I'm cooking dinner, I'll head over to the stove and put it next to the stove. But we are going to feed this once more later today. It's the morning right now. I'll feed it in the evening and we will get it back to proper health. All right, it's about 7:30 in the evening. We last fed this around 11 a.m. and it's been off of the heat mat for a couple hours because I needed the space to prepare dinner. So I'm going to show you what this is looking like now, and then we're going to feed it one more time before we go to bed tonight. So here's what it's looking like after being on the heat mat for a couple of hours, and it's already super, super bubbly compared to the last time we saw it. So that's already a really good start and a sign that this is going to do just fine. So I'm going to discard half of this and then we're going to feed it again just like we did before. So we're going to do another about half a cup of flour, throw in some water, and mix this up. Make sure you scrape down the sides. And I think that's pretty good. You can see it's still a little lumpy, but can still move around freely. So that's consistency we're going to go with tonight. So we'll throw the lid back on loosely. So I'm not going to throw this back on the heat mat tonight. I'm just going to put it on top of my stove. I was cooking on it earlier for dinner. There's still little residual heat left over, but I'm just going to set it right here on my stove and let that sit overnight. And we will check on it in the morning and feed it again. All right, here's how we're looking on day 2. It's looking pretty bubbly. I can hear it, some bubbles popping. You can even see it a tiny bit. But that is looking really good for being in the fridge for at least 6 months now. One tip I want to give that's been really helpful for me, knowing if your starter is doing well or not, is a smell test. I read once when I was first getting started that it should smell kind of like an overripe banana. So you have bananas that look like this. They're a little bit brown. It has a little bit of a sweet smell because as bananas get browner, they get sweeter. That's why you use them in banana bread and they get all nice and mushy. This is what sourdough starter smells like. So if you know what this smells like, then that's exactly what this should smell like. And that test has helped me so much in knowing whether my sourdough starter is good or if it's going bad. When I did my very first sourdough starter, my first ever try, I started it on a really hot day and I ended up using tap water by accident instead of filtered water, and it's bubbled over and it smelled horrible. Like it smelled like garbage, and that was very, very bad. So I started over, and ever since it has smelled exactly like the sweetness of overripe bananas, and that's helped me a lot. So hopefully that little tip will help you as well. I've discarded half of this, so we're back down to here again. So we're gonna feed this again today, and my goal is I'm gonna try to catch it when it's at its most active point, so probably in about 2 to 3 hours from now. And if I can make the time today, I think I'm going to attempt making our first batch of bread so that we can see after only 1 day of reviving this out of the fridge, we'll see how well the bread rises and show you that it really just takes no time at all to get your starter back out and going again. So here's how it's looking. Pretty lumpy, but also comes off my spoon easily, just like pancake batter. So we will let this sit right here. I'm not even going to put it on heat today. We're just going to let it sit right here, and I'm going to try to catch it when it's most active and show you what it looks like. So it's about 3 hours later on day 2 after we fed our starter, and I did end up putting it on a little bit of heat, so I'll show you what I did, but it's looking really great. I was using the oven to make lunch. I ended up making some quiches that are completely demolished now, but these were little mini egg quiches. So what I did was, since the stove was warm, I had my Dutch oven here, and I just placed my sourdough starter in the middle of it, and it was just slightly warm to the touch. But it's looking amazing right now. This is what I would consider ideal. It's super bubbly. It's, you can see, gotten quite large in size. We're a little more than halfway now, and I can physically see it moving and popping bubbles and forming bubbles. So this is what I would call an active starter. So I'm going to make up a batch of sourdough bread right now, and we will bake it in the morning, and we will see how light and fluffy and bubbly this becomes after having a starter that's been in the fridge for 6 months. To make our sourdough bread, we're going to start out with 3½ cups of flour. This is just an organic all-purpose flour, the same flour that we've been feeding the sourdough starter with. Next, we're going to mix in 1 1/3 cups of warm water. And then we're going to be doing 1/2 cup of our active, bubbly sourdough starter. Make sure you get all of that good stuff in there. And lastly, we'll do 2 teaspoons of salt. So now you can either mix this with your hands, or I have one of these Amish dough hook things, but we're just going to mix that all together, and then we're going to let it rest for about 30 minutes so that the flour can get nicely hydrated by all the water. And then after that is when we're going to start all of our stretch and folds, so that the dough gets lots of nice, good air bubbles in it. So here's our dough. It's pretty sticky consistency, I would say, but I'm just going to cover it with some plastic wrap, or you could do a damp towel or something like that. And we will just let this sit for about 30 minutes, and then we will start stretching it and getting air bubbles. So it's been about 30 minutes since we put this dough together. So I'm going to unwrap it. And I got my fingers a little bit damp. And what we're gonna do is take one side of the bread, we're gonna stretch it up as far as we can get it to go. It's ripping a little bit, but that's okay. And then we're going to fold it over to the other side. And then you just go around and do that to all 4 sides of the dough. Just stretches up as far as you can make it go. And this is what's going to get all of the nice bubbles into it. So that's all we have to do right now. We're gonna let this sit for another 15 minutes, do it again, and we're gonna do this about 6 times before we let it rest for the rest of the day. So it's about 8 o'clock at night, and here is my dough that's been sitting out for a while. You can see it's risen because it's now touching the top of the plastic wrap that I have on it, and it's looking pretty good. Here's what we have going on right now. So I have my Banneton basket, and the next step is we are going to dump this out on our surface. We're going to fold it together into a nice tight ball, and then we're going to put it in this basket, and it's going to go into the fridge overnight, and we will bake it in the morning. I'm going to put a little bit of flour down on my surface, as well as putting some flour in the basket. That way it doesn't stick. We're going to dump our dough out with the help of a bench scraper. We're just gonna lightly form this into a ball. I don't want to handle it too much because it's nice and light and airy, and I can see a bunch of bubbles in it. So we're basically just going to put 2 parts in the middle. Can you see all these bubbles? That's exactly what we want. Lightly form into a ball. Turn it all the way over, and then we're just gonna start kind of folding it towards ourselves so that you get a little tension on it, and that helps it be springier. All right, got our ball, we've got our bubbles. Gonna put it in our basket now with the seam side up. So it looks like this. And then we are just going to cover this with plastic wrap again, put it in the fridge, and we'll see it again in the morning to bake. Good morning. We're in the morning of day 3 now. I've just gotten my bread out of the fridge, unwrapped it from the plastic, and I have my oven preheated to 500 degrees with my Dutch oven in it. So it's been heating up really nice and hot. And now what we're going to do is we're going to turn this out onto our surface. We're going to score it with one of these little blades here. And then we're going to get it into the Dutch oven for it to start baking. So I'm going to show you how I score this, put some flour on top, and then we will get it baking. So this side's going to go down on our surface. So we're going to flip it over. And then we're just going to add a little bit of flour on top. And then we're going to score it. This isn't quite my forte, but we're working on it. But all you really need is a few cuts in order to give it a nice little pattern and for it to rise the way that it needs to. All right, that's good enough. I should have done this step before, but you need a piece of parchment paper, and I should have dumped this out onto the parchment paper, but here we are. We're still fine. But I'm just going to gently take my bread, plop it into the middle of paper like this. Now we're going to put this into our super hot Dutch oven. So the bread's now in the Dutch oven. It's in 500 degrees and I'm going to cook that for 20 minutes. And then I'm going to lower the heat to 475, take the lid off. I'm going to bake that for another 25 minutes and then our bread will be ready. Here it is, fresh from the oven. And this looks so good and it smells so good. And look how tall it is. It's risen so nicely. And I'm excited to slice into this, see how many air pockets we have, how many bubbles we were able to achieve, and get some butter on this because it's definitely never as good as it is fresh out of the oven. So now is the time to capitalize on tasting this bread. So let's cut it open. Look at the amazing steam rising off of this, but look at all these holes. That's what you want to see. Not super dense. It's light. It's full of air pockets. This is looking amazing. It's so good. It's super crunchy on the outside, but it's nice and soft on the inside. So I want to show you how my starter's looking. I haven't fed it yet this morning, so it's been 24 hours. It's still got some bubbles going on, but definitely needs to be discarded halfway, fed again this morning, and I'm quite confident that it's going to be nice and bubbly again. It smells super mild, just a slightly sweet smell that we talked about. So I'm really happy with it. So I hope that this video has brought you some encouragement because it can seem very intimidating to get started on this. This is about 1.5 years old now. And I'm pretty proud about that because it took me a really long time to start. And you can turn that into this so easily. I mean, it takes less than a week to get your starter established. And I have put it in the fridge many, many times. And you saw that it barely took a day to get it back revived. So I want to give you some tips of things that I think are really important if you want to keep this sourdough starter healthy enough to be able to revive over and over again after you put it in the fridge. So a couple of things that I found important is that I always use the same flour. I use an organic all-purpose flour. You can use so many types of flour. I know people make them with rye. You can make them with wheat. I think it'll be a little bit denser, but I've just consistently tried to use the same flour. I used bread flour once to feed my starter. It made it a little bit different texture, but I know there's many ways you can go about it, but I just kept mine the same and it's done well. I've also made sure to use filtered water. Now this may depend on where you live. Where I live, my tap water out of my sink we don't drink. It has some not great things in it that I don't love, and so I filter it through my refrigerator. So I always make sure to use filtered water. When I started making my starter for the first time, I actually had to completely scrap it after about 2 days because I accidentally used tap water to feed it instead of using the filtered water, and it developed a really bad smell like instantly. So I'm quite certain that that was the problem and I had to scrap it and start over. And ever since then, it has smelled exactly like the way I explained. This really has been a huge test for me, is that sweet, ripe banana smell. It should be very mild, but it should not smell worse than that. It should not smell overly sour. It should not smell like alcohol, I've heard people saying. It just has this slightly sweet smell, and that's how you know that you're still on track. Also, a great way to help your starter along, like I've been saying, is a heat source. So if you have a heat mat, just set it on low. It doesn't need to be very high. If you're cooking something on the stove or in the oven, just set it next to your stove, and the residual heat will help that. Especially this time of year, it's cold. If you have hard countertops, they can be very cold, and you're just basically putting a cold glass jar onto a cold countertop. But if you want to get a lot more activity going, just put it on a very light heat source, not something super hot. If it gets super hot, this can tend to bubble up and over and spill out, and you'll start getting that bad smell. So just very light heat if you need to get it a little bit going, or it's a little too cold in your home. Make sure it only has a light, sweet smell, and then make sure you're using good flour and a good water source. And if you're doing that, you should have a very healthy starter that you can revive over and over again and continue using for things like amazing crusty bread. You can make cinnamon rolls, bagels, all good things like that. I have a couple videos on things I've made with my sourdough starter on my channel, so go check them out. I hope this has encouraged you to either get yours out of the back of the fridge or go ahead and start one if that's something that your heart desires. And I want you to know it's so much simpler than you think it will be. And if you're looking for more from scratch cooking things like having sourdough starter and making your own bread products, or you want to make some simple swaps, I have a free ebook linked in the description where I have 5 simple swaps to start making from scratch. So go ahead and pick that up, and I have a lot more from scratch cooking coming up, especially for the Thanksgiving season I'm really excited about. And so I hope you'll subscribe and stay tuned for more. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.